Good afternoon and welcome to the 12th Annual School of Visual Arts and Design Art History Symposium. It is a pleasure for us, the faculty, to have everyone here so you can see what the students have been working on. I would like to thank Dr. Margaret Saho for her support of this symposium. I also thank Dr. Carrie Watson and Melissa Geppert. Dr. Zaho is always willing to evaluate these papers, so I appreciate that so much. We have 4 presentations this year. I will be introducing the speakers individually, and the presentations should run around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll hold all questions towards the end. Dr. Zaho handed the abstracts to you and also an evaluation sheet. We will be giving prizes this year, which are supported by our director, Rudy McDaniel, so we're very grateful for that. Our first presenter, Percy Brashear, is a junior art history major at the University of Central Florida who takes special interest in the themes of diverse gender presentation and sexuality throughout antiquity. With a previous BA in journalism from UCF, his passions lie in implementing hard-earned research skills to present art as an honest reflection of the culture that shaped it. Percy will pursue research of androgyny in Greek antiquity for their honors undergraduate thesis program with me, Dr. Colon, beginning this summer, and plans to attend graduate school after finishing their degree in 2025. Percy also works as a full-time writing center coordinator for Daytona State College. Let's welcome Percy.
Hello. How are we today? Good? Awesome. Okay. So my presentation is on the androgyny of Bacchus in Baroque art. I specifically focused on Caravaggio's Bacchus and Velázquez's Los Barracos to convey different opportunities that artists in the Baroque had to find self-expression, whether it be from their a perspective of sexuality or diverse gender presentation. So I will be reading my paper to you and then discussing different aspects that I researched. All right, okay. So Dionysus or Bacchus, the Greco-Roman god of wine and revelry, has a consistent image and personality across art history. As the youngest of the 12 Olympians, the god, who will be referred to as Bacchus in this paper, is often depicted in the Baroque period, which spans from the 17th century to the 18th century, as visibly youthful, drunk, joyous, and surrounded by the adoration of his followers. This is primarily seen in the Southern Baroque period in regions such as Italy and Spain, where classicism and Catholicism were intertwined to produce a cultural interest of the mythological. Androgyny, sapphism, and phallic imagery are also associated with Bacchus, which seamlessly extends into both the Italian Caravaggio's implementation of his lover as model for the god and the Spanish Velázquez's careful depiction of Bacchus's dress. By viewing Caravaggio's Bacchus and Velázquez's Los Barracos through gender and queer-directed lenses, which impose the feminine and androgynous upon the masculine, one can draw a further connection between cultural self-expression and the art of the Baroque. Whether intentional or not, the differences of the god Bacchus's appearance in art and the environment he is placed in during the Baroque period not only reinforces the idea of centuries-old queerness, but also offers artists an explorative outlet for gender fluidity in a society that condemned such identities. Michelangelo Merisi di Caravaggio painted Bacchus from 1595 to 1596 during his climb to renown, in the height of the Italian Baroque. During this period, homosexuality was punishable by death under the Holy Roman Empire. Male lovers who deviated from such expectations often kept their relationships or even the mere existence of such desire as secret as possible. However, there was a social understanding of pederasty and Socratic relationships, as such instances were not considered to fall under the umbrella of sodomy. It should be noted that because of this, renditions of artist romantic love, whether the recipient of such love was a counterpart to a Socratic relationship or an adult male whose desire was legally unacceptable, were often subtly shown through the strokes of a brush or the motifs presented to the viewer, rather than through socially typical gestures more often seen in heterosexual couples. Furthermore, James Saslow describes this cultural disapproval as the source of his difficulty in directly attributing queerness to specific artists. It is the nearly universal condemnation of homosexual activity by Renaissance authorities, both civil and ecclesiastical, and the resulting tendency of artists and others to downplay, conceal, or deny such behavior, he says. From Florence's 70-year campaign by the Office of the Knight to root out sodomy in the Quattrocento, to the intense moralization of illicit deeds and art commissioned by the Church in the Baroque, little explicit evidence exists to present the notion of comfort taken in one's own queerness during the period. Yet Saslow asserts the study of queerness in history, specifically the queerness of artists, is worthy of a place in scholarship. When viewed without bias, the evidence of such behavior and its artistic expression is abundant enough. It is a profile of the wide range of psychological and aesthetic sensibilities that arose from or were directed to homosexual experience. To examine such sensibilities and highlight the freedom art could provide when under the commission of religious figureheads, it therefore becomes necessary to analyze the product of these artists' mind, namely the masterful paintings they created, which often took months or years of meticulous labor and attention to detail in order to convey the intended message. Caravaggio in particular was a notable figure in the Baroque period, not only for the art he created, but also for the lifestyle he led when rendering such important pieces. While creating tenebristic masterpieces and nearly single-handedly revolutionizing the aesthetic of the Catholic Church, Caravaggio took part in several illicit scandals with a variety of flavors. From murder charges and dueling habits to insinuation in court of homosexuality and frequent public conquest for intimacy, the painter was rarely as saintly as the men he painted. Yet this was also his strength. By indulging in painting the simple banality of humanity and the naturalism of the world he lived in, Caravaggio brought the godlike to the public. This understandably carried over into his secular paintings, which illustrated to the masses both moralizing lessons and classical myth. Described by Catherine Puglisi as the stylistic climax of Caravaggio's series of young boy portraits, the piece Bacchus is painstakingly painted from oil onto canvas, as though the god were more sultry seduction than refined model. With a glass of wine held delicately in one dirt-crusted hand and the soon-to-be unraveled bow of his toga in the other, Bacchus invites the viewer of the painting to take part in a feast of fruit and flesh while reclining on an antique sofa. Through the god's titillating gaze and the exposure of the right side of his body, the unspoken promise of revelry becomes clear. It is unsurprising, then, that the model for Bacchus, Mario Minetti, was likely Caravaggio's lover. Through precise attention to detail in Bacchus's eyelashes, the flush of his face and the curl of his lips, and even the nervous tremor to his hand, the expression of queer love and adoration is illustrated in lifelike naturalist detail. While there are clear implications of queerness, what does this depiction do to promote the understanding of Bacchus's gender identity in the Baroque? How does this relate to freedom for self-exploration and the expression Bacchus's presence brings for queer artists? It is important to note that, in contemporary society, the relationship between gender and sexuality is more divided than it was in the Quattrocento and Cinquecento. In her 1990 book, Gender and the Politics of History, Joan Wallace Scott defines gender as the act of struggle for power. By breaking the idea of gender into two separate parts, gender as an element in social relationships based on perceived sexual differences, and gender as a signifier of place in the hierarchy of power, Scott creates a space for viewers to examine the complexity of Caravaggio's art and the nuance of masculinity and femininity in the Cinquecento. Furthermore, Yumi Kinoshita asserts the title of Homme Fatale as a worthy examination for this Bacchus. She says, the lack of fixed gender identity in Caravaggio's painting and the ambiguity of his sexuality puzzle the viewer because it is difficult to see the meaning, which is constructed socially and politically. In other words, the viewer may not understand what Caravaggio is communicating through his boy paintings because Caravaggio's symbolism is not based on conventional gender roles and expectations. Kinoshita presents the term homme fatale as a pairing to the femme fatale. Such people are seen as forbidden, sinful, and dangerous, ready to draw unsuspecting men away from their faith to steal their virtue, and therefore condemn them to spiritual death. When placing Meredith Bacchus in the position of homme fatale, Caravaggio applies powerful feminine traits to both an already androgynous god and the queer man posing for the portrait, and provides a space for ambiguity during a time where homosexuality and cross-dressing were criminal. Not only does this reinforce the idea of art as shelter for queer self-exploration on the part of Caravaggio, but it places Saslow's assertion of the range of queer sensibilities within the Baroque in plain sight. Despite the Church's best efforts, culture within the Italian Baroque was not homogeneous. When viewing such a society through a queer-directed lens, as prompted by Scott, art is the obvious harbor for those privileged enough to experience it. Another unique depiction of the god, one that includes much subtler but nonetheless critical contribution to the discussion of gender ambiguity in the Baroque, is Velázquez's Los Barracos. Though placed within the Spanish Baroque rather than the Italian, the culture Velázquez was immersed in They're placed within the Spanish Baroque rather than the Italian. The culture Velázquez was immersed in experienced similar oppression of queerness through the Catholic Church. Michael Rock writes of Spain's severe consequences. The Inquisition in Barcelona prosecuted 102 cases of homosexual sodomy and put 14 men to death. In Valencia, tried 156 and executed 34. And in Saragossa, tried 187 and executed 27. Scholars of early modern Spain, such as Christine Berco, assert the excessive machismo of the Spanish patriarchy, in which even aesthetic indulgences such as curled hair or perfume for men were frowned upon, dissuaded queer expression on a level of detail that the Italian Baroque lacked. Berco writes of the feminization of queer men during the 15th and 16th centuries as the main weapon against homosexuality. He says the anxiety lurking behind the possibility of passive anal sex reflected social fears regarding the inversion of gender roles. Adolescents imbued with the common culture of penetrative masculinity generally frowned upon any possibility that would turn them into the female partner. Because of the strict culture of the Spanish Baroque, queer self-expression was infinitely subtler. It was not likely that Velázquez himself identified with any of Saslow's homosexual sensibilities, but the mere subject of Bacchus provided a rare outlet for imposing the androgynous and feminine upon the masculine. Created in 1628, Diego Velázquez's oil-on-canvas work of Los Barracos illustrates a sense of the young god, or a scene of the young god, surrounded by fawns and laughing men paying tribute to Bacchus, as he bequeaths a laurel to a kneeling worshiper. Despite the close interaction and confined space these characters have with one another, Bacchus is in bright contrast with his surroundings. His followers are dressed in contemporary, earthy-toned clothing. Bacchus's torso is nude and his lower half is draped in a rosy pink satin. It is still a surprisingly naturalist painting in which stark tenebrism, along with the lifelike depiction of dirty working men, creates a Caravagesque environment for Velázquez to bring this scene to life for his patron, King Philip IV of Spain. Also called the Triumph of Bacchus, or the Topers, Los Barracos provides this cultural contrast with Caravaggio's Bacchus. Where the Italian painting thrums with the seductive intent of unapologetic homme fatale, the Spanish painting focuses on the liveliness of Bacchus's worshippers and his amicable relationship with them. Moreover, the painting plays with the masculinization of what is often feminine and Scott's gender signifiers of power and hierarchy. As discussed in Eric Cospo's Writing the Phallus for Dionysus, Iconography, Ritual, and Gender Deconstruction, Bacchus as a mythological figure seems to disregard all stereotypical meaning or purpose for gender in his ritualistic practices. Other male gods often reflect the athletic ideals of their worshippers, but not Dionysus, who in the Bacchus, as the stranger, is often called womanish because his hair is sleek, says Pentheus, from unfamiliarity with wrestling, and his flesh white from deliberate avoidance of outdoor activities. And that is a quote from Caspo. This can be seen in Los Barracos. Bacchus is visibly paler than the rest of the men surrounding him, with his hair carefully pinned into an ivy laurel, crowning his head in a manner that would have been frowned upon in contemporary Spanish culture. His skin is softer, rounder, and brighter than his worshippers. Caspo continues to assert Bacchus's gender ambivalence by reminding readers those who worship the god of wine and revelry were often cross-dressing women, some of whom carried the symbol of their god, I can never pronounce this correctly, thyrsus, or a phallic symbol created by a hollow fennel stalk with an ivy wreath at the tip. While perhaps unintentional, it is curious that Velázquez chose to paint the god surrounded by men, and could feasibly paint toward the fluid relationship between queerness and gender identity that Scott asserts. This is only solidified by Caspo's studies of Bacchus's style of dress. As seen in Los Barracos, Bacchus wears what appears to be an undone ankle-length chiton. Caspo asserts that this style of dress was nearly exclusively feminine or androgynous throughout antiquity. And even if it is true that Dionysus's garments might have been interpreted as archaic or foreign, and that they themselves were merely ambivalent, the fact is that they could be and frequently were perceived as womanly, he says. While gender queerness might seem non-existent in Velázquez's Los Barracos, several subtle indications of fluidity compile into solid signifiers, leaving its viewers, especially those who are queer or informed on Bacchus, with ample evidence to create connection. Neither Caravaggio nor Velázquez is admitted in any way to perceive deviance in their sexuality, and the gender ambiguity of Bacchus, or lack thereof, in both paintings, left both artists' reputation unscathed within their contemporary culture. This is unsurprising, as Claude Summers reinforces Saslow's difficulty in presenting explicit evidence when discussing queerness during the Baroque. Given the fierce homophobia prevailing in Europe during the Baroque era, Summers says, historians seeking to reconstruct the lifestyles and works of queer artists often have to depend on undocumented anecdotes and innuendos. She asserts that alongside reminders, the laws surrounding sexuality and gender were vastly different and exponentially stringent throughout the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Inquisition. That within the workings of queer partnership, there were often gendered power structures, and that contemporary queer labels and community are not applicable to the Baroque. In many cases. This reliance on rumor can create muddled interpretation of reality. Yet art itself is subjective. The act of engaging with it through unique lenses of research to derive meaning is a foundational aspect of art history, and its space of self-expression is equally as valid as that of creating art itself. Furthermore, art history as a part of cultural studies is critical. Art is a reflection of the culture that made it, and whether it falls within the acceptable limitations of the dominant community of the time or creates a contrasting statement by implying clashing ideals. From reinforcing the idea of centuries-old queerness to offering artists an explorative outlet for gender fluidity, examining Caravaggio's Bacchus and Velázquez's Los Barracos through these queer and gender-directed lenses further illuminates the variety of the god Bacchus's appearance in art during the Baroque period and the lack of hegemony within the cultures he was painted for, be it through subtle use of feminine symbolism or the flagrant temptation of the homme fatale. The utilization of the god Bacchus not only presents the related mythology to draw from, but also allows artists freedom they would not typically be provided in societies that criminalized homosexuality and cross-dressing. As scholars like Scott and Caspo share, it is important to note that analyzing history from several centuries in the future will undoubtedly skew hypothesis from truth. Yet there is still ample evidence to support the young god's gender ambiguity, to understand that well-informed artists such as Caravaggio and Velázquez would be aware of its presence. Saslow's assertion of the importance of queer art history creates a framework with which it is possible to respectfully and curiously analyze art and culture to an extent that it would have been seen as unacceptable in these artists' contemporary periods, therefore giving voice to voiceless loves long past. As previously stated, art is a reflection of the culture that it was made in. It can't exist within a vacuum. Because of this, those who are fascinated by the Baroque today, especially those who place themselves within queer culture, especially those who place themselves within queer culture, as Caravaggio and Velázquez could not, have the opportunity to see themselves and draw meaning from such beautiful art. So that is my paper. Sorry, I'm very much not the public speaking type. But is now where I would take questions. Oh, okay. There you go.
Thank you so much, Percy. Thank you so much, Percy. Our next speaker is Meredith Miller. Meredith Miller is a third-year undergraduate student in the art history program here at the University of Central Florida. Since the fall of 2023, she has been working as a student assistant for the university's Curriculum and Materials Center, a library dedicated to education students. Her current research interests consist of symbolism within Renaissance and Baroque paintings, as well as art from ancient Mediterranean cultures. After graduating in the spring of 2025, she plans to receive her Master's of Library and Information Science in pursuit of becoming an art librarian or museum archivist. Let's welcome Meredith. I don't know if you want to, do you want to clip it?
That would be helpful. Test. Can you hear me? Yes? Alrighty. Okay. Well, hello. I'm Meredith, and today I'm going to read my paper, The Canvas as a Mirror, Exploring Allegorical Self-Portraiture of the Italian Baroque. Alrighty. Portraiture has continuously followed the art world, discovered from the sculptures of ancient Roman emperors to the portraits of nobility seen in the medieval periods and beyond. Such portraiture has typically been created for the collective purpose of expressing a sitter's power, celebrating and legitimizing one's rule through the medium. However, the notion of the artist choosing to depict oneself, that is, creating a self-portrait, had not been popularized until 1490 in central Italy. As the peninsula's Renaissance art period had reached its finale, more of the upcoming Baroque period's most notable artists devoted select works to their subject of their own self. Naturally, a range of diverse self-portraiture emerged within the genre. As some works contained the direct depiction of the artist's face to canvas, other pieces depicted the artist through the guise of allegorical figures. By exploring the latter subject through the works of Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio and Artemisia Gentileschi, it can be determined that allegorical self-portraiture of the Italian Baroque were often created in order to fulfill and express specific and complex narratives to the painter's audiences. When discussing the characteristics of Baroque artwork, it is objectively difficult to exclude Caravaggio's impact on the Italian art community at the time. Despite his unruly and argumentative behavior, Caravaggio received patronage from influential art collector Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, who helped contribute to the artist's fame and success. Through the distinct naturalism and excessive tenebrism within his works, the artist later acquired several followers of his art style that would be labeled as the Caravaggisti. While the painter's most notable works commonly depicted religious scenes, Caravaggio produced numerous self-portraits, including one of his earliest works, titled Young Sick Bacchus. The painting portrays the young pagan figure Bacchus, god of wine and inebriation, seated in a three-quarter view while clasping a bundle of grapes. The portrait carries typical iconography seen in allegorical paintings of Bacchus, seen in his classicized laurel wreath and toga, as well as the source of his creation, grapes for wine. However, what is most intriguing about the portrait is that the sitter appears to be ill, shown by his desaturated skin and near blue lips. To further accentuate the sickly state of the god, both his fruit and fingernails carry grime, a characteristic considered unnatural for such a high, immortal figure. Caravaggio's distinct artisanship is present in the piece, as seen in the near black background which frames Bacchus, along with his naturalistic rendering of anatomy, weight, and light. While Young Sick Bacchus does not explicitly label itself as a portrait, art critics and historians have collectively identified it as such through both resemblance of Caravaggio's physiognomy and the timely event of the artist's admittance to the Ospedale della Consolazione, hospital for an unknown illness during the same time of the painting's creation. Robert Longhi, the scholar who was among the first to attribute the painting as a self-portrait, argues that the sickly appearance of Bacchus is in reference to a personal episode which led to his hospitalization. Additional scholars have explored theories on why Bacchus as a figure was chosen to sit in this portrait specifically. Many argue for it to be an allegory for melancholy, seen in the dead, unreflecting nature of his eyes, while some also explore Bacchus as a prefiguration of Christ, with the grapes alluding to the Eucharist. However, Christina Hermann Fiore suggests the notable theory that the portrait served the theme of paying homage to artistic inspiration. As further elaborated by Philip Morel, by having Caravaggio link himself to the god who created wine, he likens the artist's act of painting to divine creation. Caravaggio implies Bacchus's own invention through the tightening of arm of his figure, seemingly about to squeeze the grapes held through clasped fingers. The sickly aspects of Caravaggio Caravaggio adds to Bacchus allows the figure to be humanized, and as such, he becomes an appropriate body for the hospitalized human artist himself to mirror into. Furthermore, despite his disheveled appearance, Bacchus' status as a god and his ability to create wine still remains. Thus, by rendering himself as allegory, Caravaggio conveys a similar theme. Despite his own weakness of illness or any other sort, he is continually able to create such illustrious artworks. Within young sick Bacchus remains no unfinished details, with even the absence of saturation to be purposeful by the artist's hand. While the specifics of this piece continue to be debated, it can be concurred that Caravaggio's self-portrait brings the allegorical god down to humanity, in which the artist himself explores his own turmoil with themes of morality, ability, and sickness colliding. While praise of Caravaggio's talent followed his name across the Italian peninsula, so too did the controversy of his character. It was common for Caravaggio to engage in several fights, typically in bar settings. However, such aggression developed to something greater when on May 28, 1606, the man murdered a man by the name of Ranuccio Tomasoni in a brawl. Immediately following his act of bloodshed, Caravaggio was sentenced to abunde capitale, in which a reward would be given to whomever brought back Caravaggio's head on behalf of the state or the Pope. Fleeing Rome and skipping throughout southern Italy, Caravaggio continued to escape prosecution by being sheltered by his remaining patrons and admirers. From the sanctuary, the artist returned to painting for his loyal commissioners. Following over a year after his sentence, news from Rome relayed that the Pope's nephew, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, was arranging a pardon for Caravaggio that would spare the artist's life. Hearing of this, Caravaggio began to paint his work, David with the Head of Goliath, to give as a formal repayment to the kind deed. There is a recognizable shift in content and mood between young sick Bacchus and the painting following Tomasoni's death, potent with a new somberness and harsh reality depicted within the scene he creates. Caravaggio's David with the Head of Goliath features the youthful Old Testament hero David with his left hand extended, holding the beheaded giant Goliath by his long curly hair, whose dead eyes and slack mouth remain open as fresh blood spurts from his severed neck. Once more is the painting engulfed by tenebrism, allowing only David's figure, his sword, and the giant's detached head to be discernible to the viewer. Similar to his Bacchus, Caravaggio inserts himself into the scene as an allegorical self-portrait. However, what makes this work truly unique is that Caravaggio reflects himself not only in the monster that was Goliath, but in the hero that David was as well. What directs the details of this artwork is its function to sway the papal audiences to officially grant his pardon, in which all aspects of the portrait allude to the artist's repentance of his crime. The most obvious of this is by his insertion as Goliath, exposing his contemporarily aged and bearded self as the grotesque and terrorizing giant, denying himself any forgiveness or glamorization. David's figure, which features a similar head of curls and facial reconstruction, reminiscent of the artist's earlier Bacchus, serves as Caravaggio's younger and more innocent self. David, whose name is translated to beloved, stands in this scene as a future king, an individual who is beloved and gifted power through God himself. Here, Caravaggio contrasts his ugly reality with the potential he could have been, the most beautiful among the sons of men. Hence, the young Caravaggio who stands as David gazes back at his older, beheaded self, eyebrows furrowed and eyes filled with pity and remorse as he reflects upon the monster he will inevitably become. David's sword, which lays centrally across his pelvis, is inscribed with the phrase humilitas occidit superbium, or humility conquers pride, in which his blade is used to cut off his aggressive and prideful past self. Additionally, a bloody wound sports itself on Goliath's forehead, mirroring the mark of absolution given by a priest after confession to absolve the sins of the confessed. Together, these features directly state Caravaggio's intentions of salvation from his past sinful self as Goliath, and hopes to regain his footing as David, a great artist and an individual as pardoned by the state and papacy. Even more so, with the Abunde Capitale still active for Caravaggio during this painting's creation, there is no humble act greater than for the artist to deliver his head to the state himself through his own work. Ultimately, for Caravaggio, he was separated from his painting due to an unrelated and wrongful arrest, and had later died trying to return on foot to the ship which carried it. When David with the Head of Goliath finally reached Borghese in Rome, what remained of Caravaggio's goodwill lay memorialized on the portrait's canvas. After Caravaggio's death in 1610, The imagery of his artwork survived through the creations of the Caravaggisti. Among his devoted followers was Artemisia Gentileschi, celebrated as one of the most talented female painters of the 17th century. In a society which expected women to remain at home as a mother and wife, Artemisia defied the typical roles of women to pursue art, traveling far to obtain commission from high-level patrons. Found in her body of work is self-portrait as the allegory of painting, also referred to as la pittura, in which Artemisia depicts herself in the act of painting on canvas. Unlike Caravaggio's allegorical self-portraits, Artemisia's work explicitly labeled itself as both self-portrait and allegory in order to clearly establish a relationship between the figures. Physical features of the artist are identifiable through the rendering of her strong brows, high cheekbones, willowy neck, and her pulled back wavy hair. Similarly, a multitude of iconography associated with the allegory of painting, as commonly described from Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, are present within the portrait. Such icons include the golden chain with a pendant mask around her neck, used to symbolize imitation, unruly locks of hair dictating the defined frenzy of artistic temperament, and the color-changing garment, or drappo cangiante, which allude to a painter's skill of depicting hues. Through this self-portrait as pittura, art historian Mary Garrard argues that Artemisia created an entirely new image that was unavailable to any male artist. The idea of a self-portrait through allegoria pittura was unattainable to male artists not only due to gender, as one could not fully identify with the female personification, but through indirect allegorical expression, which did not permit the painter to directly enhance his own personal status as well. Allusions to pittura's symbols, such as the golden chain with a mask pendant around a male figure's neck, did not make the sitter immediately recognizable as an artist. However, male artists could not use studio paraphernalia to signify their artistry in portraits, as it implied the physical labor that a painting required, which in turn demystified the implications of an otherwise high-ranking nobleman. Hence, Artemisia's La Pittura creates a fresh depiction of the allegory, in which painter, model, and concept are one and the same. As a woman, Artemisia could effortlessly insert herself in the female figure's role. Furthermore, while male artists steered away from the indication of labor within their works, the physical depiction of painting contributed to Artemisia's portrayal of full devotion and involvement with her own work. The portrait depicts the artist spanning her body across the canvas, stretching both arm and paintbrush high among her right, with additional brushes and a large palette in her left. As she moves, the golden necklace of pittura slips across her chest, seemingly unnoticed by the artist. Similarly, the mess of hair framing her face further depicts Artemisia's indifference to her appearance, as she is caught up in the heat of work. The typical icons of pittura further allude to Artemisia's technical skills as well. For example, the mask pendant, which hangs from her gold chain, has traditionally been read as a sign of mimesis, showcasing Artemisia's ability to replicate real-world elements in her paintings. Furthermore, she communicates to her audience her artistic knowledge not only through the use of such naturalism, seen in the folds, shadows, and anatomy of the figure, but from her rendition of the drappo cangiante, successfully painting the transition between colors and the chiaroscuro within the dress. Overall, the function of Artemisia's self-portrait is to display the legitimacy of herself as a female artist during the Baroque era. Even the depiction of her hand involved in the action of painting subverts the expectation of masculine creation, in which the hands were considered to represent the brain, an organ that is effectively masculine in prior Renaissance beliefs. Combating the misogynist expectations and stereotypes placed upon women, Artemisia Gentileschi depicts herself not as a coquettish mannequin, but rather as an artist intensely and thoughtfully absorbed in her work. Art historian Elizabeth Cropper reiterates this notion, writing, "Through this gesture, the entire composition captures a sense of embodiment of Artemisia's art. Her consubstantiality with it, for the moment of inspiration, speaks Artemisia's own name, Arte Misia, or let art be for me." La Pittura further argues Artemisia's stance as a female artist through the dual depiction of identities within the figure. We immediately recognize what the painting portrays, a female artist fully engaged within the act of painting. However, Pittura encases both the allegory and Artemisia in her body. The Artemisia portrayed may hold her figures, but it remains a theatricalized version of herself in which she is dressed using the props of Pittura. The naturalism within the painting, such as the shifting necklace or the creasing of the drappo cangiante, serves as props as well, paradoxically underscoring the fact that they are staged. Art historian Jessie Locker elaborates on Artemisia's embrace of theatricality, stating that her self-portrait insistently reminds the viewer through these details of realism that they are not only self-portrayals in costume, but insist that they must be read in two ways. Thus, we separate Artemisia as allegory and Artemisia as painter, the invisible body who physically produces this illusion on the canvas. In turn, her theatricality makes us hyper-aware of Artemisia's reality, in which she reinforces that it is her, the painter, who has portrayed herself as such. Therefore, self-portrait as an allegory of painting demands the audience to view the creator of the work as no one other than Artemisia, emphasizing her skill and technique as she directly portrayed in the dramatized act of painting. By utilizing allegorical figures, artists of the Italian Baroque were allowed to explore more nuanced themes within their own portraits. Young sick Bacchus could not contain the unnervingly complex array of thoughts pertaining to sickness and creation if it was simply a painting of a disheveled Caravaggio. Immersing himself as a deity allowed for the artist to ignite discussions of flawed humanity for which he purposely intended for. Similarly, it would be difficult to explore Artemisia's true intentions of declaring herself as a legitimate artist in her self-portrait as the allegory of painting if it were not for the figure which stands as the personification of the art form itself. Not only are the artists granted the creation of deliberate messages through these allegories, but are allowed to expand on the reference narratives to create a unique dialogue of their own. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
I was ready to go.
Good job.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Our next speaker is Jules Condés. Jules Condés is a senior in her second year at the University of Central Florida, studying art history. She is interested in the history of the Global South, the depiction of the other in art and media, and Latin American culture. As previous participant of the Art History Symposium, Jules is honored by the opportunity to once again present her research. When she is not studying, Jules is a substitute teacher and yoga instructor. Let's welcome Jules.
Thank you. Before I begin, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here today. And this research that I'm about to present is edited from a larger paper that I wrote. So for your own sake, I won't be going into all of the points that I bring up in the beginning. So let's go ahead and begin. Remedios Varo, Peregrinaciones. As if she painted with her eyes rather than with her hands, Remedios sweeps the canvas clean and heads up clarities on its transparent surface. In their struggle with reality, some painters violate it, or cover it with signs, explode it, or bury it, flay it. Remedios volatilizes it. It is not blood, but light that flows through its body. Octavio Paz, Remedios Varo's appearances and disappearances. Born in Spain in 1908, the artist Remedios Varo would spend the most prolific decades of her career living and working in Mexico, where she came to be celebrated as one of the country's most beloved painters. The events of her life that led her to settle in Mexico and the inspiration that she found there are traceable through the large body of work that she left behind. Simultaneously a loss and a transformation, Varo's migration from first her home country to France during the Spanish Civil War, and then from France to Mexico during World War II, were essential to her development as the inventor of fully formed fantastical realms. Isolated figures, often solo travelers, abound in her paintings, as do repeated images of wheels, stars, threads, and imagery associated with the esoteric. These figures, usually donning banal expressions, engage in whimsical and perplexing situations which imply completely developed narratives and painstaking planning on the artist's part. Furthermore, many figures bear Varo's likeness, closely connecting the artist's psychological reality with the adventures of her characters. One perspective of viewing Varo's painted protagonists is as pilgrims of a sort.
Pilgrim, derived from the Latin peregrinus, meaning foreigner or traveler, has several definitions applicable to Varo's oeuvre. One who travels on long journeys, and in its literary form, a person regarded as journeying through life. Although many of Varo's paintings depict literal travel and movement, such as the escape and exploring the sources of the Orinoco River, some of her pilgrim's journeys lead them inward, or on a more conceptual path, such as in Harmony. Other works suggest a place between the external and the internal, an unsettling stasis, as witnessed in Roulotte and The Red Weaver. Exile is an alienating force, and Varo conveys this through employing imagery suggestive of the other, allusions to travelers, and characters that either embody femininity or who exist outside of the gender binary as androgynous. Interestingly, however, Varo's appropriations of motifs of otherness do not repel the viewer from the figures, creating a hierarchy wherein artist and viewer look down upon the figures. Instead, the viewer is invited into the intimacy of the world depicted on the canvas and the characters that inhabit it. As fantastical as the scene may appear, and as otherworldly as the protagonist's task may be, searching for the source of the Orinoco River, the viewer is taken right along on that journey, seeking alchemical truths, attesting to Varo's not just formal skill, but her ability to translate complex emotions regarding the human condition and communicate her own personal history. In 1941, war raged on the European continent. By year's end, the US would officially join World War II on the side of the Allies. Meanwhile, Poland, France, and other European countries suffered under German occupation, and it would be another 3 years before the liberation of Paris. Also in 1941, Varo arrived in Mexico with her partner, the surrealist poet Benjamin Perret, but it would be another 14 years before she debuted her work in her adopted country. After years of living in instability in Europe, Varo carried few possessions with her, among them a postcard decorated with a photograph depicting her birthplace, Angles, Spain, and a letter and small painting from her friend and fellow exile Victor Brauner. In 1945, the war ended, the Allies victorious. In 1947, Perret returned to France, and though the stay was originally meant to be temporary, Varo remained behind. She went to the markets in Mexico City, collected pre-Columbian artifacts being sold from Tlatelolco, and made illustrations for a pharmaceutical firm. Varo even participated in the staging of Marc Chagall's Allegorical in 1942, designing costumes for the production. With her close friend and fellow artist Leonora Carrington, Varo made fish-flavored flavored tapioca pearls that they then dyed black to give them the appearance of caviar and pass them off as such to friends. Carrington, like Varo, had fled Europe not long after her partner Max Ernst was taken captive by the Nazis, and she suffered a stint in a Spanish mental institution following an emotional breakdown. Varo would later say, "I came to Mexico searching for peace. In this country, I have found the tranquility that I have always searched for." It would appear that both these women found it. Varo would spend the rest of her life in Mexico until her death in 1963. She remarried a final time, and after her debut in a group exhibition in 1955, she enjoyed popularity and a sustained income from her art. But it is in these images that one can see Varo reckoning with her past, and after all, the artist had escaped not just one war, but two. As a young woman, Varo attended Madrid's School of Fine Arts following a strict academic curriculum. Even this early in her career, she had an affinity for the fantastical and often visited the works of Hieronymus Bosch and Francisco Goya at the Prado. Varo completed her studies in 1930 and in 1936 met Perret, who had come to Spain to volunteer for the Republican fighters the same year that the Spanish Civil War began. This conflict, which would last for the next 3 years, ultimately ended in the democratically elected Republican government being overthrown by the military general Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. At the end of the war, at least 200,000 people had died as a result, and more than 500,000 Spaniards were displaced. Immediately following Franco's success, his regime violently repressed the left, imprisoning and executing those with Republican ties. Varo's younger brother died in the conflict, and her then-husband, Gerardo Lizarraga, who was fighting on the side of the Republicans, was forced to flee to France, where he was interned in a concentration camp. With Varo's support, he was eventually released. Varo, however, would not remain in Spain long enough to witness most of the brutality that was still to come. In 1937, she followed Perret to Paris, where she became familiar with the Surrealists, even attending aperitif sessions hosted in cafes by the founder of Surrealism, André Breton. Breton and Perret were close friends, and both were central to the development of Surrealist ideology in the 1920s. The influence that the formal techniques of Surrealism had on Varo are evident in the work she would create nearly 2 decades later. techniques such as soufflage, decalcomania, and blotting. But it's worth noting that at this time, the artist we recognize today as Remedios Varo was not yet creating her iconic works and was still developing stylistically and formally. She did exhibit with the Surrealists, but as her biographer Janet A. Kaplan notes, she created images that look like skillfully rendered representatives of the worlds of Salvador Dali, René Magritte, Wolfgang Paulin, and Victor Brauner, all of whom she numbered among her friends as well as her sources. Despite the Surrealist gatherings and the lifelong friendships that Varo made, life in Paris was unglamorous. Since she had fled the violence and uncertainty of the Spanish Civil War, Varo would not be able to return to her home country had she wished it. After Franco's rise to power, Spain's borders were closed to those with Republican ties. Varo was effectively cut off from her family. To make money, Varo forged the work of Italian artist Giorgio de Chirico with a friend and was not unaccustomed to a day's meal consisting of just a cup of coffee. Of this period, Varo said, "That bohemian life that is supposed to be necessary for the artist is very bitter." It was soon to come to an end, though. In September of 1939, Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany, invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. A little less than a year before the city was occupied by the Nazis, the cultural hub that was Paris began to feel the imminent threat of war. Foreign refugees flooded the city, and for Varo, a foreigner herself, the possibility of deportation loomed. In 1940, Perret, an outspoken communist and political activist, was imprisoned in Brittany in a military prison, and soon Varo was too, due to her connection with him. Upon release, her friend Georgette Dupin housed her and noted that after incarceration, Varo was terribly traumatized and shaken. Varo never spoke of or left any written record of her experience whilst imprisoned. The art she would later make may reveal the psychological state of someone reflecting on the feeling of captivity. Things were to grow more dire. In June of the same year of her incarceration, the Nazis invaded Paris, and Varo, along with 8 million refugees, fled. By 1941, Varo had made her way to Marseille, where a small community of surrealists, as you can see, banded together, awaiting foreign aid and funds so that they might be spared the onslaught of war. Among these artists were Breton, Brauner, the Cuban surrealist Wilfredo Lam, and Perret, recently released from prison. When they were finally able to leave France, the two main factors that influenced Varo and Perret's choice to find safe haven in Mexico were the first being that as a communist, Perret would not have been able to gain entry into the US, and the second being that Mexico had opened its borders to Spanish refugees, granting them automatic citizenship. With this knowledge of Varo's background up until this point, we were able to recontextualize her work not just as rich imaginaries, but as Kaplan calls them, exorcisms of adult terrors. As mentioned, Varo was unable to resume her personal work right away, stating, "I came to Mexico searching for the peace that I had not found, neither in Spain, that of the revolution, nor in Europe, that of the terrible war. For me, it was impossible to paint amidst such anguish." When she did begin painting again, it was with new clarity and precision. Roulotte was completed the same year as her Mexican debut. The title, referring to a caravan, depicts one, its interior glowing a bright orange. The roulotte is also closely related to the vardo, the wheeled caravans used by nomadic travelers in Europe. Victor I. Stoachita writes about the nature of the traveler, which others them from society. Nobody knows where they come from or where they're going, nor why they first set off along the path of endless wondering, or even when. Their tenuous relationship to the mainstream is isolating, and indeed the two characters within the painting are the only visible life forms. The landscape through which the caravan travels has no clear path and is made up of a muted mix of browns and grays, full of a texture which obfuscates the scenery and destination. This is due to Varo's employment of blotting, hatching, and decalcomania. The wheels of the caravan suggest motion, and yet the characters give the impression of stillness. The interior illumination draws the viewer's eye to the female pianist who sits at her instrument, facing away from the journey ahead, her disinterest in it appearing intentional, her posture straight, and her attention fixed to the piano. At the time of Roulotte's completion, Varo already had an established relationship with her final partner, Walter Gruen. Gruen, an Austrian exile, survived internment in German and French concentration camps and came to Mexico around the same time Varo did. Roulotte highlights this relationship, which began in 1952. Gruen, at the helm of the caravan, supports his partner as she creates. The warmth of the caravan suggests an emotional safety, but the journey on which these two pilgrims embark is unclear. Even though Varo was comfortable with life in Mexico, the emotional toll of her past remained, and this painting shows navigation through one's past, present, and future. The next year, Varo painted The Red Weaver. There is once more an emphasis on interior spaces and desolate exteriors. Here, the pilgrim's physical journey is mere hypothesis. A figure made of fabric floats in midair, her body centered in a closed room with no doors or windows, save one which looks out onto a foreboding sky. Although her body leans toward the open window, she remains tethered to the room. Even as she casts a glance over her shoulder to the viewer, a blurry woman in the background knits her into existence. Also in the background are hooks in the walls from which hang lifeless fabric bodies. They may be discarded past projects of the seated woman, their droopy, faceless forms in sharp contrast with the wide-eyed, intelligent gaze of the girl in the foreground. The dark blue rendering of the background woman, her body fading into the floor and walls behind her, juxtaposed with the fiery red of the girl in the center, characterizes the former as the fabric girl shadow. Thus, the shadow can be understood to be the present other of the body, a fact enforced by the rule of light so that the shadow can even be seen to be a form of self-representation. However, the fact that the woman is in the act of creating the girl, as well as the title of the painting, Red Weaver places the powerful act of creation in the creation's hands, complicates the relationship on display. Who is a projection of whom? Another complication is the long blue thread, the same color as the seated woman, winding from the ceiling and out the window. Is there another figure which has floated away, but who is unable to escape the claustrophobia of the interior space? And if the girl is able to leave the room, will she too remain tethered? That being said, Varo, who owned numerous cats, paints a bright-eyed kitten into the foreground. The kitten plays with a ball of yarn that seems to emerge from its own tail, adding both humor and a reinforcement of the cyclicality of the scene. In a triptych, Varo depicts some of her most dynamic scenes. The Escape was completed just 2 years before Varo's death and is part of a narrative told across 3 separate paintings. The series charts a young woman's journey to freedom, beginning with Towards the Tower, which shows a group of identical young women on bicycles being led by a nun and a sinister man out of a beehive-like structure. Only one of the young women glances away from the group and toward the viewer, an intense awareness in her gaze. The second painting, Embroidering the Earth's Mantle, features the girl covertly manifesting her own freedom. Varo employs the art form of embroidery, historically associated with domesticity and women's work, as a tool for self-empowerment, recalling contemporary artist Jenny Savile's aim to paint the female. You can see she depicts herself and her lover in the folds of this fabric. In The Escape, the young protagonist and her lover flee, their attention focused on the horizon as they head towards a small, dark tunnel within hostile cliffs. They ride a contraption which resembles an upside-down umbrella, and though threads connect from the device to the young man's cloak, it is the girl's firm hand which guides the couple. Together they float on golden clouds which erupt like pollen, and their clothing fades into each other. It is these 2 figures who are Varo's most concentrated, driven by the task at hand. Although their future is uncertain, there is a sense of completeness derived from the painting when examining the triptych as a whole. They are pilgrims with a purpose. The girl has escaped a repressive environment, and rather than journeying alone, she finds wholeness and companionship in her lover. The drama is heightened as the couple moves diagonally up across the canvas. The potential for their future is evident. Interestingly, Teresa Ark notes Marija Gimbuta's description of caves when analyzing that same potential toward which the couple head to in the cliffs. Caves, with their hidden, cool atmosphere, exude a mysterious quality perhaps equated to the regeneration of life itself. The enclosed spaces of caves symbolize the birth canal and the womb of the goddess. Wherever their pilgrimage leads them, the golden clouds buoying the couple along promise an optimistic fate. In recent years, Varo's relevance has experienced a resurgence. In 2023, the Art Institute of Chicago held the first retrospective of Varo's work since 2000. The exhibit, entitled Remedios Varo, Science Fictions, focuses on Varo's varied interests, collecting work she made during her mature artistic period, as well as preparatory sketches, personal journals, and books. You can see my cousin in the green sweater right there. Even Varo's personal crystals, which she would energetically charge under the moonlight, were on display. And with these crystals, Varo would scratch the paint on her canvases, recreating the sgraffito technique in her own unique way. These details capture the viewer's imagination and speak to an audience in a country where more than 46 million people were born somewhere else. Varo's paintings are relatable to those who recognize feelings of uncomfortability in their environment, who have felt like wanderers, both with or without purpose. And in works such as The Escape, there is a feeling of resolution, while also recognizing that the path is never quite clear or finished. Her preparatory drawings, such as the one for The Escape, reveal the level of planning and detail that went into executing a piece. Varo was fully invested in her fantastical worlds and their inhabitants, and the viewer cannot help but to be so as well. Reflecting on Varo's early interest as an art student in the work of Bosch and Goya, the words of theorist André Malraux come to mind. If Bosch introduces mankind into his infernal world, Goya introduces the infernal into the human world. Varo's work does neither. Her paintings, just as detailed, just as masterfully executed, are illuminated by an inner light, as Octavio Paz describes it. One does not agonize alongside her pilgrims as one might with Bosch's or Goya's characters, but embarks with them on their journey, sharing their knowing glances. Although the early years of Varo's life were fraught, and some of her pilgrim situations reflect this, their pilgrimages also reveal a simple, universal truth. Regardless of the conditions or circumstances, all must journey through life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. And I'm sure you've noticed, but we go in chronological order. So we have our last speaker. No, we go in chronological based on the work. No, we're going chronological the way the works are made. We're going through time. So this is our last speaker. So Sam Sonken is a senior undergraduate student, currently pursuing a dual degree in art history and anthropology at the University of Central Florida. His academic writing experience covers a breadth of subjects in both fields, from the scientific to the humanistic, from the historical to the modern, and across various cultures. He has previously presented a research poster on travel literature and archaeotourism at the 2022 UCF Knights Right Showcase. He is particularly interested in where art history and archaeology overlap with museology, when archaeological artifacts are recognized both as works of art and as symbols of national and cultural pride. He is currently a volunteer at the UCF Gallery and a Jenkins Community Arts Scholar at the Manila Museum. After graduating in 2025, he plans to continue his education through postgraduate museum studies. Let's welcome Sam.
Okay. Before I begin, I would like to note that I composed this paper at the end of 2022. Well. Since then, there have been several technological and social developments regarding artificial intelligence in art and other fields. An entirely new paper could be dedicated to what has changed since this research, with additional points and comparisons, such that I have decided to leave the temporality unchanged. My intent in this work is to examine artificial intelligence objectively, because ultimately it is unlikely to go away. It must eventually have some sort of status in the art community and the world at large, whether positive or negative. In the past year, a developing technology has emerged into mainstream awareness, appearing on social media websites as a novelty for some, an art form for others, and a cause of concern for yet others. Artificial intelligence art programs like DALL-E, Midjourney, or Stable Diffusion allow any user to enter a verbal prompt into a text box, and the chosen program, based on its store of visual and terminological data and past experience, will generate an image that interprets the verbal prompt. Essentially, based on art and design techniques gathered from images and illustrations fed into the program, it is able to take a descriptive sentence of subjects, actions, descriptions, even art styles, or any sentence for that matter, and come up with at least one visual representation, albeit not always a fully finished or convincingly real image. When considered as a new and distinct means or medium for creating art, it is sure to eventually enter the art discourse, and in multiple ways it already has. The question that emerges is, how should we view AI art from an art historical, contemporary, and critical perspective? How does it fit into the community of arts and artists? Is it even welcome? In my deliberation on the medium, I hope to objectively consider some interpretations of these points and illustrate the emergence of AI art as it currently stands. First, I would like to examine the history of artificial intelligence art and the recent emergence of the modern form. One form of AI art, likely the earliest, was actually being made in the 1970s by Harold Cohen. An artist, professor, and later a researcher of programming and artificial intelligence, he created Aaron in 1972, a program which could independently draw abstract works, like Amsterdam Suite 2, in black and white and later color. A physical device, called a turtle, was a small drawing machine which would crawl over the paper canvas, making marks in a manner comparable to freehand. While the program did not accommodate any specific drawing commands or inputted data, it would design compositions based on a series of design rules, which were reconciled with what was already being randomly drawn on paper, and a map of the work as a whole. In an interview with Cohen for the Computer Music Journal in 1979, he described the technical creation process, which is a part of the display when exhibited, and the product as an art, but more specifically, he considered Aaron to be a contribution to the philosophical dialogue on what constitutes art, specifically as work which is originally devoid of specific intention. Cohen's interpretation of his own work is relevant to us as a part of our present discourse on the identity of new AI art, but another considerable factor is the discourse more contemporary to this first AI artist and his works. An MIT journal series named Leonardo, which focuses on the interdisciplinary applications of science and art, beginning in 1968, is a noteworthy platform of discourse on the developments of AI art. An article from 1981, Artificial Intelligence and Visual Art, by Peter Kugel, is noteworthy for a perceptive anticipation, or attempt at anticipation, of the potential for AI in art and art criticism of the future. The article briefly mentions contemporary applications of the computer to art and criticism, and also notes how people may appreciate it as a novelty, but question the overall purpose. Regarding the specific uses to be found for computers or AI in art, Kugel states, "One reason artists might wish to use computers is to produce variants of their artworks in order to relieve themselves of manual labor. Another reason is that computers may help one to obtain a better understanding of the aesthetic qualities of artworks and of the processes by which they are produced." What is unusual and ultimately inaccurate in this article is that, looking forward from that time, Kugel is conflating the future of computer and AI technology in the arts from the 80s on. In reality, the computer's role in the art world developed independently of artificial intelligence for decades. Kugel suspected that logic-based AI art programs would be used by artists to save labor, or as a form of technical inspiration. While these are practical applications to be considered, AI art programs in their current form have initiated a much more complicated discussion, with many more factors, both positive and negative, generated from a variety of parties concerned with the implications and very real dangers of the technology. But first, I should introduce the recent development concerning modern AI art programs, like DALL-E. It may seem unusual to look a half-century ahead for the next subject, but the particular focus of my analysis is generative AI art programs, those which create a distinct image without any one visual reference. Modern textual prompt programs are the next major development in this technology. DALL-E, seemingly the initiator of the technological trend, was created in 2021 by OpenAI, a company which experiments with multiple applications of AI technology and programs. DALL-E 2, which is still in development as of 2022, newly utilizes neural network processing, comprehensive interconnected knowledge, and offers a few new functions. For example, the capability of editing an existing work with new information or extending the dimensions of the picture to include new content. Recognizing some potential dangers of their program, OpenAI is censoring or controlling the use of certain topics including politics, violence, pornography, and real likenesses, as far as living resemblances relate to the aforementioned and other potential issues. Each image from DALL-E 2 also includes a watermark to express in clear terms that it is an AI-generated image. This iron-branded logo on any AI image, which is technically removable, is an act in response to a much more complicated philosophical, ethical, and moral dilemma on the new frontier of AI art. A primary concern to artists of other media, perhaps even as far back as the 70s, has been the threat that artificial intelligence art may pose to the painter, the graphic designer, the commissioned artist, and so on. The shared unease is in the fact that working as an artist may no longer be feasible, even as competitive as the field already was. A company may be able to just refer any artistically minded employee to a program like DALL-E to experiment for days or even hours and come up with a workable idea. An artist on social media working for commissions may find that their customers would rather see their ideas realized while experimenting on Stable Diffusion. On top of this, it is possible that a neural network like DALL-E 2 may be ignoring copyright or ownership of the myriad of images it uses for inspiration. Many of these factors have come together to inspire a general antagonism or ambivalence toward AI art by the artistic community, even toward those few cases where it is difficult to distinguish between a fellow artist's work and that of an AI. Showing support for the work of a digital artist online has the potential to become an ordeal. New artists often need the encouragement, but it can feel like a betrayal for an artist to unknowingly compliment an AI work, or even discredit a digital work that appears to be artificially generated. Some entrepreneurs are using programs which make public domain images to produce and sell products, demonstrating some of artists' fears. Also of note, an AI work named Théâtre d'Opéra Spatial won a Colorado art contest earlier this year. It is important, on the other hand, to consider how this technology benefits the general public and its users. It is championed by its proponents as a democratization of art in the same way that Kodak democratized photography with affordable cameras. Some AI art programs are accessible freely, and others with paid membership. Either way, the common individual without art experience may be able to materialize their artistic ideas without struggling with their artistic ability. For the open-minded artist, they may be able to make drafts or experiment with the composition of visual ideas. Photo and image editing tools are a useful and sometimes necessary skill for cleaning or personalizing an AI image, and this could become a new niche. Stepping outside of the moral philosophical conflict, doesn't the rift sound familiar? I would argue that it bears a striking resemblance to the controversy which erupted contemporarily to the advent of photography. In fact, I think additional comparisons can be made between the AI image and the ready-made, as well as the photograph. Perhaps these are the sorts of questions which will drive new interpretations of AI art. In 1859, art critic Charles Baudelaire discussed the relatively new technology of photography. Supportive of modern art, but highly critical of realism or photography, he had this to say about its emergence as an art form. As the photographic industry became the refuge of all failed painters with too little talent or too lazy to complete their studies, it is simple common sense that when industry erupts into the sphere of art, it becomes the latter's mortal enemy. If photography is allowed to deputize for art in some of art's activities, it will not be long before it has supplanted or corrupted art altogether, thanks to the stupidity of the masses, its natural ally. Photography must, therefore, return to its true duty, which is that of handmaid of the arts and sciences, but they're very humble handmaid, like painting and shorthand, which have neither created nor supplemented literature. What man worthy of the name of artist and what true art lover has ever confused art and industry? Disregarding specifically the weight of this hostility, one could seamlessly imagine that the subject of these criticisms, with just a few words changed, is instead artificial intelligence art, and the result is imaginable as the newest step in the Hegelian dialectical cycle of art movements and media. One could argue that AI art programs are for the unskilled or lazy, that they are fated to polarize against traditional art forms, or that they will ultimately replace tradition. One could recommend that they stay as a tool for the artist, or that artists should stay far away from them. Ultimately, however, photography has earned a distinct place in the world of art media. It has not replaced painting. It generally does not divide artists as it used to, and it is considered to take talent as any other medium. Other critics of photography were concerned that it would push painting, particularly realism, into obsolescence as the best mimic of reality. Realism, however, is a style still pursued by painters today, and so are all the other arts which Baudelaire considered to be in peril. Artists will surely continue to create, admired by those who appreciate their efforts, even as AI art programs are improved. An entire paper could study the manner in which photographs like Rylander's Two Ways of Life and Robinson's Fading Away were combination printed, synthesized in a way that parallels the use of Photoshop on some AI art. If photography did not supplant the arts, then surely AI will not either. As for comparing AI art and the ready-made, the similarities to be observed are more abstract. A ready-made was an existing object until the artist declared it to be a work of art. One facet of this development was that it was an unprecedented form of art making. There is, however, also the fact that the ready-made involves the thought of the individual and takes real subjects or objects and deems them art. AI text-based programs are comparable as art made by a written descriptive request, which also utilizes real subjects and concepts and involves the thought of the user to deem an image an artwork. Just as one may ask, is calling Marcel Duchamp's fountain an artwork, a form of art, one may also ask, is this fusion of making ideas and using descriptive writing a form of art? To say nothing of effort, for those contemplating the ethics of the commercial use of AI images without crediting the program, isn't this comparable to the way that an artist of the ready-made may not credit the draftsman or designer of the object? Ultimately, the most likely future of AI art is for it to become an artistic practice of its own, a medium which is generally acknowledged, distinct, and perhaps not considered as provoking as it once was. This seems to have happened in the 19th century with the camera and in the 20th century with the ready-made. The history of art is often a story of the next generation rejecting older traditions for newer innovations, only for those innovations to ultimately become a part of tradition. In this way, I suspect that AI art is similarly destined to find its niche in the artistic community of the future. Thank you.
The speakers come up and answer questions. If you don't,
I'll answer. Well, congratulations to all of you. Thank you so much for your presentations. My question is for Jules. Thank you for that detailed background of her history and how her own biography and migration kind of life would influence those paintings. I'm curious how much you think also, like looking at medieval manuscripts, religious imagery, it seems very clearly to me to be, a kind of a death scene at the end, either across it. There's very much visually, it seems to harken to some medieval imagery. How do you, was she religious? I know you mentioned the crystals.
Well,
I don't know.
I absolutely agree with that point of like, when I was looking at it, these paintings aren't that big. Some of them are like this big, honestly. And there's such a level of detail in there. You have to get closer to see it. And some of them she even includes like mother of pearl inlay into the painting. And that was actually a part of my paper that I cut out for today's presentation, which is I draw a comparison between, she is an isolated as an artist working in exile. And I talked about the monks from Iona, which I learned about in medieval, who, due to Viking raids, are displaced, by, an event of violence and completed their work elsewhere. So that is definitely something that I want to continue to explore with her work, because they do also have just even some like weird little moments in them where it's like when you're looking at medieval art, you're like, why is this little critter doing a handstand as like a sheep eats an apple from a bush, weird little thing. And she has, kind of perplexing imagery like that I think engages the viewer kind of in a whimsical way too. And I definitely think she was familiar with that. She, as a young woman, attended Catholic school where they were instructed by the nuns, in Spain, of course, which prior to the Spanish Civil War, the clergy had a huge influence in Spain. So that was part of her early education. But even at that young age, she was interested in like texts from like the Far East and this like idea of esoteric. She had her own tarot that she brought around with her all the time, and she and Leonora Carrington were doing divinations from the tarot. So yeah, definitely that is a point of comparison there that I also took up upon. Thank you.
My question is for Percy. Thank you. Well, thank you all for your presentations. I was really struck at looking at yours, especially with this comparison between Caravaggio and Velázquez, with this nature of the performativity of gender and sort of public versus private space. You have this single portraiture in an intimate environment of a room versus what very much seems like this outdoor space and, a whole cast of characters involved in this painting. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of that contrast. And I know you talked about the country's different perspectives on queerness, but it would be great to hear a little bit about the performance of gender.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my paper, I do talk about how there is that kind of there's a little bit more of a lack of distinction between gender and sexuality in that time period as compared to today. But specifically for Caravaggio's Bacchus, I talk a lot about how the privacy of I've been researching more about how the privacy of that space for Caravaggio and Mario Medici, the model, kind of gives Caravaggio the space as painter to step into, should he so choose, that area of very delicate queer love, it seems to me. And it also provides Mario Medici the space, should he so choose to take it, that area of he can step into the space of an androgynous god and stand in his own in this conversation that model and painter have with one another. And I think it's very gentle in a way. I think it's very it's a very beautiful thing to kind of look at. And then the kind of public space that Velázquez's painting takes up is a really interesting dynamic, considering how subtle his kind of steps into the gender ambiguity are, especially considering the everything aside from Bacchus himself and the fawns seem to be contemporary. He could have taken the men he was painting off the street to paint them. They're in contemporary style dress and clothing and style and all that kind of thing. And I think it's interesting that he continues to push boundaries like that. It feels like in very subtle ways. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Well, I'm going to hit all of it, so I'm going to go away for a while. I'll start with Jules, and this, because it was exactly my first thought, Carrie, was religion in this. Her background, what I see is sort of kind of blatant Catholicism, and the fact that the one painting of her leaving this monastery looks very much like a miniature with that sort of stacked Gothic architecture behind her. They're being led by a Dominican nun. The habit is very distinct for the Dominicans in a black and white with a wide-brimmed hat. And even in the image of where she's weaving, right, it's really stressed, particularly for young women that are trained in parochial school, that the Virgin Mary is weaving a red thread, right? it's changed in the Middle Ages to her reading a book because it gives her some sort of claim over sort of literacy. But the fact she's weaving a red thread and the fact that the painting is red and blue, there is nobody, particularly in a Spanish background or a Catholic background, that can't read associations with the Annunciation in that painting of her weaving a red thread in this escape through a window. And so there's a bunch of color symbolism in the medieval manuscript and Catholicism, and for me as somebody who went to parochial school, it just seems to sort of drip in that. And I would love more exploration of that. And my first thought too was for Pellegrinos, for in a Catholic context, a pilgrim is almost always associated with one who takes a journey of faith, regardless of what that faith is, that it isn't just about journeying and traveling, but is undertaken in one's heart as a journey of faith, either of penance or in hope of some attrition or in gratitude, right? So I'm wondering where that works, and that it's not just a kind of ambling pilgrimage or movement through space and time, but is one done with a heart, with an intent. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So
I definitely appreciate that perspective, because that is one, as I mentioned, like I'm looking to delve into further with this. And in the context of, it is an ambling journey, I think that for her, because as an adult, she was not a practicing Catholic, or she didn't have her Bible or go to church or anything. I think at that point she was more involved in the imagery, and that's where she drew her inspiration. But like you said, she was 100% familiar with all of this, and she went from one extremely Catholic country to another extremely Catholic country. So it's not that she would have, not been continuously immersed in that. But for her personally, I believe that her journeys were kind of she was stripped of a purpose, because she had to make these decisions of like, well, now I have to leave Spain, and I don't have my husband, and my brother's passed away, and I have to go to France, and I don't know anybody here, and then I have to go to Mexico. Like, who do I know in Mexico? She founded her emigre community there, and so I do think it would be kind of a powerful point to then give her figures a purpose in their journey, or a context in their journey that is readable through that religious lens. So yeah, I appreciate that question, and I hope I addressed it well, but I would definitely love to, as I develop my research on her more, I would love to further examine that perspective, because I do think it holds such a weight in her work.
Yeah, I can't not. I see that little carriage of hers as a lantern in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the reason if it feels like we're pressing you, and you all know me, so you know the difference, but it's that these are fantastic, and we're so thrilled with the research that you're doing. Is we can't stop ourselves. I mean, all of us, right, as researchers, all of you, you get our brains going. So that's the good part. Is I have lots of technical notes I can give you guys later. To Kitty Co.
Thank you. Yes.
It's a hard C on the tequila. So then, okay.
You can remember it because Chianti.
Okay. For Percy, and I want to transpose slides. Meredith has the slide of the young St. Bacchus, which I think you need to address.
Yeah. No, I wanted to say earlier, I was like, I see a familiar figure.
Well, but I think that I would love for you to address that image in the context in which you're talking about gender and specificity. And for those who don't know, you're going to be like, this one's nuts. But at the level of the table where he sits, in a kind of strangely castrated type image, sit two round objects and a rather flaccid long one. Right. Okay, so I mean, I can't not. Yeah. So, right? Sorry. But does not, do you not now that I've said it, oh, there it is.
Wow.
Do you not, particularly his elbow sort of blocks this area in which he sits. Okay, good. Okay, so all right, because her thing came up and I went, oh, I wanted to be another two.
I could talk about this all day.
Okay, good.
So I was actually part of the Student Scholar Symposium last week, and I had this conversation a lot with like the judges or people who were like coming up, and I did Bacchus with the portrait of Bacchus. Hello, thank you. Oh, okay. Does that work? No. Okay. So basically, yeah. Mostly, I spent a lot of time comparing his self-portrait as sort of this very clear, it's contemplative. He has a lot of emotion involved in this. So when comparing this to the portrait of Bacchus of Mario Menidi, who was most likely his lover, we see a very large difference between self view versus the view of another man who I think it really increases that what I would call that queer love. It seems very even more delicate of a conversation between painter and painted versus painter and painted. And I mean here, as you were saying, you see a lot of the almost rotting fruit, the blue lips, he feels sick. But in comparison to Bacchus, of Mario, his cheeks are flush, his eyelashes are long. He's got that kind of smile. It's a very the two paintings, while they have the same subject and even the same bow on the toga, and that kind of thing, they couldn't be more different than one another. So yeah,
Just mentioning the peaches that we talk about in the class forever, so I know I want to be recorded talking about peaches. But I mentioned this in class. I think there's an article that talks about the peaches.
What I want to see more of is still also, and I don't know, maybe it's timing, but the artifice of both of them. I mean, as much as all of this is the way you've constructed it, it's also a wink, wink, nod, nod.
Right.
The dirty mattress, the fact that we're well aware that they're painted in these guises that are clearly artificial costumes to put them in the guise thereof. And so you've got another level, because who is it? Oh yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I get that. I have both of them.
But I think she was mentioning the idea of performance.
Yeah, you're stepping into a space as this god, and so there are implications of that, and what you decide to paint that as.
My other note for you was images. As you take this to conference and continue, you can't show us a slide of a poster.
Okay.
And all that text, right? There's for our history, we have some personal sort of individual kind of rules about how we present these things.
Okay.
We never want to see a slide for less than 30 seconds because you got to give us a minute. They need to be labeled, and you can't put a bunch of text up there because I can't listen to you and read at the same time.
Okay.
And then I'm losing stuff, and then I get frustrated, and then with the damn poster, and I want to see the Los Flashes. I don't know that painting.
Okay.
So I'm sitting up here going, I can't see, because I'm dying to know if there's a chicken or a rooster in that painting. But
Okay.
I don't know, I can't tell from over here.
Right.
Because then we have to have a discussion about ancient Greece and pederasty and the gifts given and some things like that may work their way into these paintings that make this very clear in terms of concepts of relationships.
Right. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
And we can just want to interrupt me in the middle of this. Questions about
Your time.
There's a question back here. Yeah, okay.
Sam, I'm so first of all, just for all of you, wonderful job. And Sam, taking up this really challenging, all of you are tackling different kinds of challenges of historiography, I think. Your particular challenge sounds dealing with, as you already acknowledged it 100%, right? It's this is changing very quickly.
Right,
So
yes.
kind of how you try to historicize a history that is unfolding
Right.
very quickly is interesting though. And so And I appreciated how you were kind of trying to look towards certain recent historical precedents of these different kinds of like transitional moments and kinds of anxieties that they provoke in terms of like our technology like interface. Yeah, so I'm just wondering how, like, so just a question and then just like a comment maybe for a sort of another historical episode that might be interesting for you. Like, my question was just like, so you bring up the kind of the sort of reference of the ready-made, and then the touch point of photography and like, so understanding of AI, I guess basically just like, are you sort of thinking about the differentiation between like thinking about AI as a tool, right? In the same way that some certain artists thought about photography as just like a tool, versus like AI as kind of like conceptual, like a kind of conceptual procedure, which seems to make it more akin to something like the ready-made, where the artist has this kind of like meta, kind of like self-reflexive criticality upon the entire like mechanization of like the commodification of art in the modern era. Like that's kind of like, it's not really about the urinal, right? It's about the gesture of inserting a mass-produced object.
It's about, well, maybe I don't know. Maybe I kind of misinterpreted it, but I thought it was, sorry.
My other, and then just another like reference if you want to, like, there's this, you know, that moment that you were talking about in the 1970s, like, and maybe you're aware of this, but it might be interesting for you to look at because there's this whole slug of, which I think makes it kind of different. This is just something that I've thought about kind of casually, nothing intensive really to offer, but just, it seems like the moment of the 1970s is super interesting because there's all these like, there's tons of initiatives that are being funded by like aerospace engineering companies and Bell Labs and New York State Art Board that are like putting artists in residence in like Lockheed Martin and NASA. And so there's this real kind of interest in trying to like use art specifically and using then contemporary artists to like to kind of like build this bridge between science and technology and like the human experience that is like really kind of like top priority for like in terms of like government granting, in terms of like private industry, like in that era. And that just seems to me to be like totally absent like in this moment. Like it's just, we're not like, you know, we're kind of still in the 1960s and like people are still investing in the NEA has just been founded. There's a ton of like, government sponsorship that's going towards the arts. At that moment, that's like about like art democracy and needing art to help us humanize. You know, there's just like a kind of cultural discourse of that in that era that like isn't part of our current cultural discourse about the arts. And I just think that that absence is going to make the way in which AI plays out kind of an interesting one because we're sort of historically at a moment where there has been just this like dialing back in terms of like robust national investment in thinking about the arts and culture. And then we have this like new technology just kind of like on the scene without any kind of like wherewithal that like artists might not just be like the victims of this, but might be put in a position to help us actually imagine new kind of like ethical frontiers, which very much seems to be at least part of like the ethos of the 1970s, and it's just like kind of not, it seems to not really be a part of the thing now. So that just might be like an interesting like era to look at, to maybe like think comparatively about as you sort of continue to track where this goes. But yeah, so what were your thoughts about the ready?
So, well, I'll start with what you just said. I think definitely there's a lot more research into art and technology in the 70s that I could do. I know I was very surprised in the first place to find out about Harold Cohen and Aaron. I did not know about that at all. I was blown away by it. And I know that in a lot of cases, there's probably more research I could have done. I think maybe for the ready-made, perhaps I kind of misinterpreted. I thought the essence of what a ready-made is the artist is kind of taking it out of its context, whatever the object is, and saying, this is artfully made. When you ignore all of its context, my biggest concern with that, because when I look at it, what I kind of think is, there is a person who designed it, and doesn't that person who designed it and created the artistic, the aesthetic appeal of it worth giving mention to? And I just thought if AI art is concerning for its lack of credit to the people who supply the database of art that it draws from, then isn't there a similar concern for the lack of credit to whatever originated what makes a ready-made? I don't know. But I probably could have addressed that better. And
There's a ton of literature about the differences.
Yes.
Right? And that it is a long phallic object that has particular powers as it's related to Dionysus because it ushers forth liquids,
Yes.
water, wines, or milk. You got all kinds of places to go with those.
Yes.
See Euripides on the power of the Theseus and what its functions are, because it's gonna work.
I have so much to read.
There's a lot. This is some things. Meredith, I have things about levels of meaning. You're right on top of it, heading for the allegorical, but you can, if you follow a medieval construct for layers of meaning, moral, literal, anagogical, and allegorical, you've got more to say, and you can structure it that way. So if you're interested, just in Ren, we were talking about layers of meaning and the following of kind of a medieval construct that allows for really 4 levels of meaning. And if you've got allegorical, you've got the others. You could expand into the sort of literal, moral, and anagogical of all of it.
Yes.
Which might be interesting and help flesh that out. And then for Sam, I didn't know anything about the other stuff either. This is really foreign stuff for me as well. One of the things that we brought up was intent, which I think is a huge part of it.
Yes.
Because that's where we differ from computers.
Right.
Is intention. So
Right.
that can be fleshed out. But I also think that my first thought was you showed the image of the Audubon image and then discussed, copyright, where is it coming from? That this part of the separation here is in one's personal experiences and knowledge that is removed by a computer who has access to all of the art in the history of art. And though we're all pretty bright, we don't have that to draw from. And so it's those things that we draw from and those things that we cannot, because we have not been exposed, that a computer has access to. And so wherein then lies, then the question becomes, if connected to intention is the fact that no art is made in a vacuum, and what an individual artist, living, breathing human has exposure to is what, in essence, is part of what comes out. And for a computer that has access to all of it, right? For me, there were connections there that were really interesting, but I haven't heard anybody talk about. That it is, it's a computer and it's generated, but I thought that's a really good thing. So that's all. I'll behave. So I think all of you were very stimulating. Fantastic. Look.
To build on what was just said, I think it's interesting, and I actually would say that part of the issue that I sometimes have is that I don't think that AI has access to all. It has access to a very limited data set that's been input by human beings saying this is what art represents. So my questions would largely be also about how these language models are built and the art that's put into the system that generates it. That would be a question on my part. And I also think that since, obviously you're doing this in 2022, and I think access, as in terms of OpenAI, has completely transformed that conversation, even in the short amount of time that we've been dealing with AI as a public. And so my question too would be not only thinking about the way that AI generates art, but the way it interprets it. Because now we have programs that can not only, you put in a prompt that says, give me a rotary telephone in a Baroque style, but you can input a painting and tell me and ask it to visually analyze what is being seen in that painting. Right, it's working both ways, and I'd be interested in the point of contrast and thinking about not only how it's constructing works of art, but also how it's interpreting art that already exists. So.